Good morning.
Good morning.
Kristin Scalzo is the Assistant Asset Manager in the Levine Institute for Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She has also held the position as a research assistant at the Center for Prevention of Genocide at the museum and at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. Scalzo has a Bachelor of Arts from Marquette in International Affairs and Women's and Gender Studies, and is currently finishing her Master's of Arts degree at American University in International Peace and Conflict Resolution, specializing in human rights and peace building. Please welcome Ms. Scalzo.
Hello. Okay, here we go. Hi, so I'm Kristin, and thank you so much for welcoming me here. You have a beautiful campus, so I'm really excited to speak with you today. So, to start, if someone were to ask you, any of you, what you cared about most, what issues you were passionate about, I'm sure it wouldn't take you very long to come up with a few items or maybe even a list of issues that you cared about, where you think change needs to happen, or where you may already be working to create change in your communities or in your school. And similarly, I think if I asked high school students and college students around the nation the same question, of course there would be differences, but most likely there would be a pretty similar list of issues. And so we can think of these issues maybe as national security, the global refugee crisis, climate change, civil rights, freedom of the press, human rights, genocide prevention, the economy, free trade, job creation. You guys will all be going to college in the next few years, and after that, you're hopefully going to be able to find jobs. But also discrimination, racism, and prejudice at home and abroad. So if we know what we care about, so what? What do we do about it? If we know, what are some of the ways that we can affect change in our communities, maybe in our school, in your home community, in your state, or maybe at the national or international level? How can we become civic actors? And what tactics and strategies should we use to work towards these goals to better our community? So, since I work at the Holocaust Museum in DC, I thought I would bring in a little history to help us work through some of these issues. So I wanted us to look at past instances of student activism, investigate what they did, think about if it was effective or not, and maybe consider would some of these still be effective today. And since, again, I work at the museum, I thought I would talk about what college students did in the 1930s and 1940s in response to the Nazi threat. So American college students, and Americans more broadly, did have detailed coverage, detailed access to coverage of the Nazi threat. They had this in their newspapers, whether that was local or national magazines, through radio, but also through film and popular newsreels. And many of the issues that I just talked about, while they are important to students today, many of them were also important to the students of the 1930s as well. So, to start off, the First World War, if you didn't know, took place between 1914 and 1918. It was fought throughout Europe and beyond, and many called it the war to end all wars. It cast an immense shadow on tens of millions of people. The total cost of World War I to the United States was about $20 billion, and more than 53,000 American soldiers died in battle. Now, World War I greatly shaped the way that Americans viewed the world and responded to events happening at home and abroad. Many believed that our involvement in World War I was a mistake and believed that we should be an isolationist nation. We were also a nation at this time, in the early 1930s, shaped by fear and xenophobia, the fear of communism abroad, and we were also not yet a superpower. Many of us know that today the US is a military superpower, but at this time, the US only had the 17th largest military in the world. Excuse me. And also, at the beginning of 1929, we were in the midst of a Great Depression, which marked the end of 6 years of unparalleled prosperity for most sectors of the American economy. In March of 1930, more than 3.2 million Americans were out of work. And still, 3 years later, when FDR was elected to his first of 4 terms in the presidency, a quarter of the American workforce was still without jobs. Now, he implemented the New Deal to try to help our nation recover economically, but for college students and for high school students, this meant, and the collapse of the job market meant, that there was much less money to be spent on student loans, and that their parents also had less money to send them to college. So, in 1934, as students began to learn of the rise of the Nazis, they were still very weary about even the slightest chance that the United States would go into war or that a world war would again break out. In 1934, 25,000 students participated in the first nationwide anti-war student strike. 3 years later, the number participating had risen to over 500,000. They coordinated with the United Student Peace Committee, which was made up of 14 different organizations, including the American Youth Congress, the National Student Federation of America, and the youth section of the American League Against War and Fascism. Now, they recognized what they believed to be the increasing threat of war, and they believed it was their responsibility, in their own words, for creating and supporting an aggressive peace policy through a nationwide demonstration of solidarity for world peace. Now, this stated on the 1937 flyer that war anywhere in the world is a threat to the peace of the United States. And only by the cooperation of the people of the world can permanent peace be established. And of course, there was student participation in this strike all across the country. Universities everywhere from the University of California to Vassar Miscellany, the University of Chicago, Harvard, and also Stanford. And students at this time were also preoccupied with instances of human rights abuses. On November 9th and 10th, 1938, in response to the assassination of a minor German diplomat in Paris, the Nazis unleashed a coordinated terror campaign throughout Germany. Hundreds of synagogues were burned, and more than 30,000 Jewish men and boys were arrested and sent to concentration camps. This event, known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, was the first instance of mass incarceration of Jews simply because, as the Nazis defined, of their race. Kristallnacht also resulted in the longest sustained American newspaper coverage of any event related to the persecution of Jews between 1933 and 1945. And it also intensified the already looming refugee crisis of those in Germany and other occupied territories who were trying to get out in fear of their lives. Life magazine had a 4-page spread on the topic, and like I said, there was on the front page of many other newspapers and magazines throughout the United States. So, to express their outrage over Kristallnacht, on November 16th, 1938, some 500 Harvard and Radcliffe students jammed into Emerson Hall on campus to denounce the persecution of Jews in Germany. At the end of their meeting, they adopted resolutions that backed President Roosevelt's condemnation of Nazis and urged cooperation in finding new homes for refugees. 3 days later, the Harvard Committee to Aid German Student Refugees was formed. And they formed a plan to bring 20 students to Harvard to live and study. Of course, they did not have the money themselves to bring these students over. So in cooperation and coordination with the Harvard University government, or the Harvard University Council and their president, as well as other people across the nation, they made a deal that they would raise the money to cover the living expenses of these students if the Harvard University would cover their tuition. And so eventually, Harvard was able to bring 13 student refugees from Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. And this student committee not only was successful at Harvard alone, but it gave rise to a national grassroots movement that helped bring hundreds of persecuted Central European students find refuge and education at colleges and universities across the United States. Now, this was especially significant because at the time, there were immigration quotas in place for who could come to the United States and get a visa from different countries. But since students were students, they were able to get student visas outside of the existing quotas. And so in December 1938, this small committee at Harvard turned into an intercollegiate committee They met in New York City, where representatives from over 100 colleges participated. And by March of 1939, the Intercollegiate Committee reported that over 170 colleges from 39 states were involved, and they had granted 214 scholarships, with room and board provided. This number of colleges involved eventually reached 213, and in September 1939, the Intercollegiate Committee merged with the International Student Service, which is still an organization that is prevalent today. And so not only were students worried about human rights abuses, but at this time, they were still very worried about the United States going to war. There were continuing debates throughout our country, and most Americans still believed that the United States should stay out of the conflict. As we know, September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, which started World War II. A year later, Americans' fears started to become more real when, on September 16, 1940, President Roosevelt signed the Selective Training and Service Act into law, which instituted the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. This meant that all males aged 21 to 36 were required to register, and some 45 million men registered, with more than 10 million being inducted through the selective service system between November 1940 and October 1946. And so the debate over entering the war led to the creation of the most wide-reaching campus-launched movement, and you may have heard this term being used lately. It's called the America First Committee. So this group was founded by a group of college students at Yale in August of 1940 who were idealistic, and many of them, to some measure, pacifists. It grew into a large umbrella organization of students, pacifist groups, but also average citizens across the states, and it provided an outlet for Americans fearful of the war and those who disapproved of Roosevelt's efforts to prepare our country for war. Now, it was not born an anti-Semitic organization, yet some of its most prominent speakers, notably the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, were personally anti-Semitic. And at its height, America First claimed it had over 800,000 dues-paying members in 450 chapters. This means it was the largest isolationist organization in American history. And around the time of Lend-Lease, where we were helping aid the British in their fight against the Nazis, around March 1941, public opinion really began to shift from total isolationism to aiding the British. And as we know, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Italy and Germany declared war on the United States, and we go to war. And at this time, America First closes its doors. And actually, its two founders, they enlist, one in the Army and one in the Navy, and both fought and survived World War II. So far, we've seen a couple different actions that students have taken. They organized peace protests about issues they cared about, America not going to war. They raised money to bring refugees over from Europe. And they also started an organization at their campus that grew into a large nationwide movement. But I also wanted to talk about two actions that maybe seem a little more simple to take. One of them is sitting down and reading, being informed about the events that are going on in our world today, and the other is actually writing about them. So in response to Nazi advances in the spring of 1938, notably the Nazi takeover of Austria, students at Brown University in Rhode Island debated about their theories of nationalism, of cooperation with England in case of war, and the probability and improbability of fighting. One thing they did know was that all of the efforts they had made to study the current events would have one benefit, and this is directly from the article. They will have studied to the best of their ability the present world crisis, and if war comes, they will know why and for what they are fighting for, or why they refuse to fight. To study the problem before them through the medium of newspapers and periodicals is the duty of every young person today. And this sentence is particularly moving. From the welter of print, we may find some gleanings of truth, which will anchor us to a belief that may keep us from being driven like straw in the approaching whirlwind. So many of these students felt like they were being pulled one way or the other, by their teachers, by their parents, by popular media, and they felt that it was their job, their responsibility, and the responsibility of their generation to know what was going on in their communities, so that if they were brought into World War II, if they were drafted, if they enlisted, They knew why they were fighting, or they knew why they refused to do so. So this is just a simple action that some of us, or all of us, sometimes forget to do. In the busy daily lives, it's hard to sit down and read a newspaper sometimes, or to really check up on the news, but it's a simple action that these students took in the 1930s that really made a difference in their lives. So what about even just writing about what you care about? In doing research for this presentation, I came across hundreds and hundreds of college newspaper articles from this time, many of them just reporting the events that were happening that day in the world, but many of them also giving opinions about what was happening and really helping to educate the students around them. Like this article from Harvard University of December 3rd, 1938. And this article was written in response to another editorial piece that was saying that Harvard University should take its financial aid, and instead of giving it to refugees abroad, they should use it for students who were already attending Harvard. So Walter Muther of the class of 1940 wrote that what has happened in Germany shocked us because it attacks our faith in this nobler nature of man. It attacks not merely our Christian heritage, but also our belief in the dignity of man here on this earth. The United States was founded by those who were persecuted abroad. It has grown, ever entrenching these beliefs in the individual worth of each character and the right of equal treatment and opportunity. And he goes on to write that Harvard University defends its basic beliefs by aiding the persecuted in its small way. Its funds are for the defense of its underlying principles. It is not so much the moral indignation, but the renewing of its own true strength. It states our reason for living. And as you've seen today, the students of the 1930s faced many crises, at home and abroad. And they chose to act in many different ways, writing and reading about what they cared about, staging protests, raising money for those who are being persecuted abroad, or starting student groups for people that thought like them. And so the thing that I'm trying to get at here is that it's important to understand the actions of those in the past to help inform our choices today. So I encourage you to reflect on what I've shared with you today and think about how it can be useful in your own lives. What kind of tactics and strategies were useful and effective in the 1930s? Are they? Or would they still be effective today, where we have much more advanced technology? We have cell phones, we have Facebook and Twitter, but also the ability to communicate within a second with people across the country and across the world. So can we really learn from these stories of action, and how can we apply it to the issues we care about? And according to the New York Times, civic engagement has evolved to mean working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. It means promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes. Individuals in the past made a difference in the lives of their communities, in the lives of their families, and also across the nation. And individuals today have that same opportunity. It doesn't have to be something as big as a 500,000 student peace protest or starting a nationwide campus movement. As our colleagues in the past have shown us, it can be something as simple as taking small actions like knowing about the events of the day or finding out how to join or contribute to local newspapers in your community or at your school. Big change really can be made through the everyday actions of ordinary people. I look forward to taking your questions later. Thank you.